I need to be snapped out of my rhythms, essentially. I need to be yanked out of that by somebody else's like magnetism or energy or electricity or static or whatever it is. Like I need that additional spark that is not of me. And I think like making room for that, not only making room for that outside spark that sometimes results in what I think is healthy conflict, but like welcoming it, like welcoming that, because it's an essential dialogue, I think. Like looking at relationship as an essential dialogue, a back and forth and all of this. And if you're not willing to make room for these another voice that is sometimes at odds with yours, then you're not having the dialogue.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. I created this podcast and the School for Good Living to share what I've learned, and to keep exploring the question, what does it mean to live a good life, and how can we do it? Despite my privilege, I lived for decades in a pretty dark place. And I know that living is often a painful, difficult, and messy business. But I also know that it can be wonderful beyond imagination, and that it's a skill at which we can improve. That's why every episode is a conversation with an author who's an expert regarding spirituality, health, relationships, work, rest, and play, or money. I also ask my guests about their creative habits, routines, and mindsets, and what they've done to get their books written, published, and read. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the School for Good Living. Everybody has passion and curiosity about something. Not everyone carries it to the point of obsession, as my guest today, Matthew Gavin Frank, does. I first learned about Matt's work when I came across his book, Preparing the Ghost, an essay concerning the giant squid and its first photographer. The story of a man who became obsessed with photographing the giant squid. Back in the 1880s, he wanted to find it and photograph it. How do you do that? Well, Matt has written about how he did that. His latest book is Flight of the Diamond Smugglers, a tale of pigeons, obsession, and greed along coastal South Africa. I learned so much from this book that I don't think I ever would have known about diamonds, about Africa, about pigeons. I learned a bunch of new words. It's a fascinating story. And Matt includes in the book about his own grief. So Matt is someone who teaches creative writing. He's a professor in the Masters of Fine Arts program at Northern Michigan University. His work has appeared widely in journals and magazines around the world. He's got a very interesting life experience, combination of travel and food and writing, and as I said, obsession. This conversation covers a lot of ground in a lot of different directions. It's definitely an exploration in my own creativity. I hope you find something here that inspires you, that intrigues you, that motivates you to put your own creative process to work, follow it through to conclusion, produce something that other people receive, engage with, whether or not it's quote unquote good, just to engage in the process and stay with it. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with my new friend, Matthew Gavin Frank. Matt, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Thanks, Brilliant. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. Will you tell me, please, what's life about?
Oh, goodness gracious. First of all, I feel uniquely ill-equipped to claim any singularity as far as that goes. Maybe it's about making a mess. And maybe it's about, I don't know, finding small ornaments suspended within that mess, both self-made and the external mess into which one is embedded, in order to, you were mentioning centering earlier. In order to find that sense of center, that sense of peace, wherein one could push forward. I think it's about hybridity. I think it's about embracing hybridity. I think it's about embracing plurality. Sometimes that gets messy. I think sometimes I need to just laser focus on a bird, for instance, within all of that hybridity and plurality. And I think sometimes, for me, what keeps me going at least is the interaction between that singular focus on something that brings me joy within the chaos, like a bird, for instance, or I don't know, a bag of dill pickle flavored potato chips. And the interaction between these singular, small, very human joys and just kind of the larger, beautiful, occasionally not so beautiful, but oftentimes beautiful chaos and tapestry that exists beyond us. So I think there's like this interaction between the small and the large, the individual, and then everything that contextualizes the individual. That it's a messy answer to a very open-ended question, but I feel as if an answer that wasn't messy, at least for me, would seem disingenuous, as if I was claiming ownership of some sort of like singular answer, which I feel uniquely ill-equipped to do because I'm riding the wave sometimes, man.
Yep. You and me both. No, thank you for that. And I'm always a bit suspicious of people who have a ready and concise answer, especially when it's the right one to that question. So, right. That's great. Thank you for that. Okay. So I might edit this so the listener still hears the enlightening lightning round in the middle, as is often how we do this. But I figured maybe we'll leave it. At any rate, we'll jump to the enlightening lightning round now, which again is a series of brief questions on a variety of topics. You're welcome to answer as long as you want. My aim, for the most part, is to ask the question and stand aside. Okay, question number 1. Please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates. Life is like a...
unlicked envelope.
Okay, number 2. Here I'm borrowing Peter Thiel's famous question. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
That living in an extremely cold climate is healthier than living in an extremely warm climate, I'll say, for now.
So if I understand what you're saying, you do believe that living in a cold climate, you believe that, but many people do not, that living in a cold climate is healthier.
I believe that living in a cold climate is healthier. Yeah.
Okay. This one I want to explore a little bit more with you because I know there's probably some monastics and mystics in the Himalaya that would agree with that, I suspect. But knowing you live on the edge of a great lake, what's your come from? Why do you say this?
I feel as if maybe because we're less equipped to survive naturally, I suppose, just with, our uniquely unfurry bodies in an extremely cold climate. And so it's kind of, we've had to become creative in colder climates in ways that that maybe we haven't quite in climes that we are innately, we're suited to. And so as far as like health goes, I feel as if, and I lived in Key West for a number of years. I grew up in Chicago, but I lived in Key West. I also lived in Alaska for a number of years. And I just felt sometimes, at least for me, and with a lot of folks with whom I associated in these places too, I felt like it was easier to stagnate, both physically and mentally, perhaps, in a warmer climate. It was because it was easier to be there. Whereas if in a cooler climate, it's harder oftentimes to be there. And so certain degrees of stagnation that are permitted in a warmer climate are not permitted in a cooler climate, strangely. And plus, it's just exhilarating. How does one engage in, there's this term that there's this condition that I love. I think the term etymologically goes back to native cultures in Greenland, but it's a condition called pibloktok, and it's Pibloktok.
That's just fun to say.
It is, pibloktok, right? And so pibloktok refers to the uncontrollable desire to tear off one's clothing and expose oneself to severe winter weather. Now, pibloktok was often dovetailed with hysteria of the freeze or something, where people died because it was uncontrollable. They would tear off one's clothes. But if one has controlled pibloktok, brilliant. Whereas if one kind of exposes the uniquely ill-equipped human body to those extremes and that extreme temperature for a short period of time, and then runs inside and huddles up and goes over by the pellet stove and drinks a hot toddy and is all good. I feel as if that exposure to that brief exposure to extremity And the availability of that in colder climates seems like refreshingly intoxicating and healthy. It also essentially snaps oneself out of one's comfort zone, which both actually and metaphorically I think is a healthy thing to do here and there, and is also good for creativity and writing and so on and so forth.
Wow. I think that's true. At least I agree with it. And I know there's a legion of Wim Hof followers who subscribe to this. And of course, he's teaching ancient wisdom as well. But as you say this, I love that Piblock talk. I have a friend who reminded me because just before the pandemic, in almost a year ago, I think it was a year ago today, this is November when we're recording this, 2020, we were in Iceland. It was my first visit. And I had the privilege of submerging in the water. And it was exactly what you're saying. I'm like, oh my gosh.
It's pretty fabulous. Yeah, I was in Iceland. It was my only time in Iceland. This was 2.5 years ago now. And yeah, just like immersing yourself, like hiking out to those natural pools, right? And just immersing yourself into these geothermal pools. It's just, oh my goodness, loved it.
Yeah. And this was I was actually looking for the photo to see because my friend texted, here it is. This was on one of the black sand beaches. And somebody, of course, got a picture, which is why I can see it now. But here's me going into the ocean.
Nice.
Where I went completely under. So the geothermal, are they warm? Because this was the cold.
Yeah, the geothermal ones are warm. Yeah. But my goodness, you look like some Norse god.
I know, look, I'm like ready for a fight. Oh, that was amazing. That was fun. Okay, so thanks for allowing me that digression. In the lightning round, I'm going to bring us back and keep us going.
This is so not lightning. I love it, but it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, there's that, what did you call it? A hybridity, maybe the paradox, right? Okay, showing up already. Okay, number 3. If you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan on it or a phrase or saying or a quote or a quip, what would the shirt say?
Don't skip breakfast.
I love it. Okay, number 4. What book, other than one of your own, have you gifted or recommended most often?
Wow, I've recommended so many books so often in various stages of my life, but right now I'm going to say Valeria Luiselli's book, Sidewalks. It's an essay collection that kind of burrows into like the hidden anatomies and meanings of world cities. She just won a MacArthur Genius Grant, and she is a genius. She's absolutely wonderful. Her work is lyrical, intellectual, spiritual. She's just questing after meaning in what most of us would dismiss as just like mundane, right? So like much of her work it engages what I love most in especially nonfiction writing, and that's taking like the seemingly mundane, the seemingly quotidian, and scratching and scratching and scratching at it until its gooey inner holiness or horror begins to leak out. Essentially, taking something that we only mistook for simple and restoring it to like its innate complexity. And in doing so, she basically uncovers the secrets lurking within the quotidian ornaments, and in this particular book, cities and settings that most of us don't look as long and as hard at. And the book is very instructive for me. It was beautiful. I read it on an airplane too, and reading that book back when I was comfortable flying on an airplane, and hopefully I will again soon as I adore traveling. Just reading that book when above the earth, when kind of like floating in that sort of like liminal space, neither here nor there. And the book itself just kind of engages even like terrestrial life as liminal, as neither here nor there. It's and our time here is liminal. It was just an amazing context in which to read the book, and it inspired a lot of thoughts in me. And so I actually do a lot of writing brilliant on, it sounds so horribly unromantic, but on like barf bags in the seat pockets. And so I just like pulled that out, and that book just inspired me to just write or at least take notes that I would return to later.
That's amazing. So just over your left shoulder, I see what might be a corkboard full of notes or what is this? Are these barf bags? What are they?
Well, it's they're Yeah, goodness gracious. I don't even know what's on there right now, but there are little scraps of notes, addresses, still an analog calendar, old receipts that for some reason I decided to keep because I don't know, I have an emotional attachment to some laundry soap I bought in, a town in South Africa or something. Yeah. So when I'm writing too, I mean, it's funny with like all of this like ephemera back there. I never have a proper notebook, and I'm always chastised if I'm interviewing folks for a book. They're always giving me problems like, why don't you get a proper notebook? Why don't you have I'm scribbling everything down on the back of just like scraps of paper, like cocktail napkins, old like gas station receipts, and just like collecting those into a big folder and then going through them later and piecing, something coherent out of the scraps. So yeah, you are seeing correctly.
No, I really love that. And I think I'll come back to this in the writing section because I realize although there probably are best practices, so to speak, when it comes to writing, as we know, it's a very individual pursuit. And what works for one person, they might use a notebook, they might use something digital, they might write on the back of a receipt. Right. That's fun to see. Okay, speaking of travel, question number 5 is, you've traveled so much in your life. What's one travel hack, meaning something you do or something you take with you when you travel to make your travel less painful or more enjoyable?
This is, again, like something that probably isn't physical. Well, I could mention maybe a physical thing, and then I'm going to mention just an attitude that
Sure.
I forced myself to. Goodness gracious, and it feels so corny because I think this showed up in that Wes Anderson movie, Darjeeling Limited. I think Owen Wilson said it to his brothers when they were traveling through India, and he said, promise me one thing. Say yes to everything. And so and I feel as if that concisely, and I think about that line sometimes, and I feel as if that concisely expressed what I felt in a much more diffuse and nuanced way as a traveler, ever since I began traveling like years and years and years ago. And that's just like a willingness to be naked, a willingness to be open and affirmative, and to just drop your defenses, a willingness to snap yourself out of your comfort zone and almost to disappear and let the place just kind of work on you and work its magic and its newness on you, and just kind of be open to that without being too assertive, without trying to like over direct, but without really trying to direct at all. So I like to make myself small and disappear while also being affirmative and allowing myself to, otherwise, I would just say, bring along some good rain gear so you could, get outside even if it's raining. I never like to be, like rain gear and an umbrella or just something like that because I'm an outdoor cat, brilliant, not an indoor cat. And so, I feel as if decent rain gear is always helpful. Otherwise, it's the standard stuff. I tend to pack light.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense based on what I know of your travels. The rain gear, maybe a Coleman Cimmaron.
You read about that, did you? So
yeah, tell me about that while we're on this about travel, because some people think about travel and they think about nice hotels. Some people think about travel and it's probably closer to Jack Kerouac.
Right. I don't know. Like I haven't aged out of tent camping yet, at least. So I've always loved sleeping. I've always loved tent camping, and the Coleman Cimmaron is a downright luxurious tent compared to many of the tents that I've slept in my life. When I was living in Alaska, I remember I was tent camping in Denali National Park right in front of Mount McKinley, as far in as you could get with the buses there, and that's Wonder Lake. And I was camping at Wonder Lake, and in front of Denali, the mountain, or Mount McKinley, as it's known, and it was so cold, brilliant. I remember, but I wanted to be outside. I wanted to be in it, and so and I wanted to be that close to the mountain. And I remember, and this was I think late October, early November, and then the park just kind of like shut down. At least. Folks could still go in there, I suppose, but you have to be more intrepid than I in order to trudge through, the snow in Denali, without a trail to, at all to guide you. But I remember waking up in the middle of the night to, go to the bathroom, and the tent canvas had frozen to the side of my face. And I remember just kind of like peeling it off of my face and watching these little miniature snowflakes fall. And I step outside, and the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis, was just out in full force, arcing over Mount McKinley and reflecting off of its surface. And so the mountain itself was glowing pink and purple and green in turns. And I was close enough to it where even if I turned my back on the mountain, it was so large that I could still see it in my periphery on both sides. It was just looming. And so I feel as if that experience was beholden to the tent. I could talk so much more about tent camping because when I first met my wife, we basically like went around and lived out of that tent and out of the back of an old Ford Windstar minivan for a while before we got married and things, and just kind of drove around the country and camped. I don't know if you want me to go on about that now, or we could talk about that later. Or
I have so many questions about how you've managed to maintain a relationship, a marriage, with somebody when you lived in such close quarters in what I imagine must have been, at least at times, very uncomfortable circumstances. And I understand your wife is from South Africa and you've traveled there in some pretty remote places as well. So maybe you can just give us a thumbnail about how you've managed to travel together. And I know, we haven't talked before today, but I would imagine if you're still together, that's a meaningful and enjoyable relationship for you. Like, how have you done that?
I don't know. I think it's beyond us in a way. Like, what did Kurt Vonnegut call us, the human being? He called us big rubbery test tubes seething with chemicals. And I feel as if, I don't know, maybe our chemicals collide and intermingle well. It's ever bewildering to me, quite frankly, brilliant, like based on, my relationships with people before I met her. It's bewildering, and I'm ever bewildered by it. And I think maybe part of why it's successful is that I'm open to being bewildered by it, and that it's mystifying to me, and I'm open to being mystified by it rather than saying, here are the bullet points to our successful relation. I feel like that would be reductive. It's as simple as we like each other, and it's as mystifying as, goodness gracious, who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, who knows?
You guys lived together after you married in a tent on the side of a road into Taos. Is that right?
Yeah.
For weeks, like weeks or maybe months.
Yeah, you found out a lot. I love this. Yeah, so we both met. We met in Key West. She, was working in a restaurant in Key West. She, had recently come here from South Africa. She's a really interesting person. In South Africa, she was a broker consultant for a multinational corporation, and just detested it. It was just, just ruining her life. Essentially, she did not have the constitution for it. And I'm just talking about her, and then I'll get to Taos. I'll try and keep this short, but she was on a lunch break by herself one day in Johannesburg, South Africa, and this had been building in her for a while, but she pulled a sugar packet, right? I mean, out of the little sugar caddy to downturn some sugar into her coffee, and on the side of the sugar packet was printed this platitude, and it sounds so silly in a way and so easy, but it just said like, live every day as if it were your last. And she just like broke down. She was like, oh God. It was exactly what she needed to see at that particular moment, even though she would normally just dismiss it as, oh, it's some platitude. It's so repetitious. And, and she went back to work and quit. And her family just, gave her so much grief about it. And she was always wanderlusty, and now like this enabled her to travel the world a bit. And eventually she landed in Key West after she had burned through her savings, took a job in a laundromat washing other people's clothes, and was never happier. And then she eventually got a restaurant job. We met in a Latin jazz bar at like 3 a.m. After our restaurant shifts, and just began a conversation that persisted. Eventually bought that Ford Windstar minivan, ripped the back seats out of it, decided to road trip the U.S. together. and this is like a really short version. We wound up in Taos, New Mexico, because we loved it and we thought it was beautiful, and we'd never lived in the high desert before. And we didn't have much money, so we had our Coleman Cimmaron tent. It was a larger tent than the one that I slept in Denali, which is why it felt luxurious. And so we set up along the Taos Ski Valley Road, where you could camp for free. And so there was just a really interesting collection of misfits and eccentrics and folks who just kind of detached from the grid, who were living in that area too. And met some folks we loved there and met some folks we loved a little less there. But it was an interesting collision of personalities. We bought this environmentally friendly soap and shampoo and basically bathed in the Hondo River, which was frigid because it was fed. It's the high desert. So Taos is at about 7,000 feet. And so it was snow fed. The river was fed by snow melt. And so it was freezing. And maybe this is why I love cold weather too, maybe because I associate it with early love. But I remember when we would immerse ourselves in that water to bathe with this environmentally friendly soap and shampoo. Once your heart dipped below the surface of the water, it was so arrestingly cold. You would just scream. You would cry out involuntarily. It would just be like, and it was just, so wonderful and refreshing. A great way to start the day. And then we got restaurant jobs there too. And after our shifts, went back to the tent and read a little bit by lantern light. And the next morning jumped into the Hondo River again.
That's beautiful. How long ago was it that you met in that jazz bar, that Latin bar in Key West?
Yeah, we met just about a month after 9/11. So it was actually mid-October 2001.
Okay, so this brings us, coming right back, the next question in the enlightening lightning round here is about relationships, which is, what's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about making relationships work? As if it could be distilled to just one thing.
Right. Yeah. In a weird way, I feel as if, some of it has to do with some of my philosophy when I travel too, because when you're traveling, you're interacting intimately because you're there in that particular space with a space that is not necessarily like your own, not necessarily something that you should dare claim ownership of, right? Or ever presume to. And so I feel as if it's similar in a relationship. There is this space, and then there is the space of my partner, and it's just engaging the affirmative as much as possible. Just like making room for Louisa being as Louisa can be, and embracing that and loving that, even if it doesn't necessarily always mesh with my rhythms, because I'm the sort of person where I need to be snapped out of my rhythms, essentially. I need to be yanked out of that by somebody else's like magnetism or energy or electricity or static or whatever it is. Like I need that additional spark that is not of me. And I think like making room for that, not only making room for that outside spark that sometimes results in what I think is healthy conflict, but like welcoming that, because it's an essential dialogue. I think like looking at relationship as an essential dialogue, a back and forth and all of this. And if you're not willing to make room for these another voice that is sometimes at odds with yours, then you're not having the dialogue. Then you're just kind of talking to yourself. And what kind of human experience is that? I don't know. Maybe that works for some. It didn't and doesn't for me. I'm not that into myself in that way.
No, thank you. Thank you for that answer. So much comes up for me there. But I just want to acknowledge, for what it's worth, I think what you said about giving space to Louisa, to your wife, is really beautiful. A teacher of mine once described love. He said, love is granting another this space to be all the ways they are and all the ways they are not.
Yeah.
And it sounds in what you're saying,
I love that. Clearly, this teacher had a penchant for concision more than I do. I love that, though. I love that. I love that.
Well, I don't think he said it in the flow of conversation. I think he had the benefit of an editor.
Well,
So
yeah.
it's all good. It's all good. Okay. What's one thing you've started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
I stopped working in restaurant kitchens, but I've continued cooking. So I feel as if this is so interesting because I think about this with writing too. Sometimes I feel as if like turning an innate passion and parlaying that into a career and engaging that occupationally is not necessarily good for the passion itself and the products, derived therefrom, whether it's a book if you're a writer or whether it's a dish if you're a cook. And so I feel as if and I'm always wondering, I'm not sure if this is true for me or not, but I think about it. I interrogate this. The fact that I'm writing now in part as a career, is that good for my writing? So when passion kind of bumps up against commerce, in a way, however small or however much you want to minimize that commerce. And you even said, talking about marketing and stuff like that, it's interesting when, that kind of creeps into the act of art making sometimes. And so there are folks who say work at something you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that, because there are side effects to turning that passion, I think, into work. Into something that beholden to a paycheck, right? And so I find that interesting. It just it imposes a new parameter on the passion, whether one likes it or not. Maybe there are certain folks who are better at separating those things than I am, and it's okay. And I think I'm still figuring it out. I'm always journeying. But leaving the restaurant kitchen, I think, because I started hating cooking, and I love cooking. I love food, but I started hating doing it under these very, very militaristic conditions of the fine dining restaurant kitchen, wherein I was sometimes working 19-hour shifts.
Wow.
It was really bad. In Key West, too, you would step into the restaurant kitchen. And Key West was a culture that, just not only in the restaurant kitchen, but it was a party culture. It was a culture that would just go, go, go. And we were asked in the fine dining restaurant world there oftentimes to work 19-hour shifts. And so you would step in there and there would be a molehill of cocaine on one end of the line. And chefs on the line would just in order to just keep going and remain on their feet and working at that fast pace, would just leave their station, do a quick bump, and jump back on. And so physically, it was just an unhealthy place to be, an incredibly unhealthy place to be. And so I needed to get out of it. And the way in which I found a way out of it was interesting, but we could talk about that later, just so I don't over answer the question.
Thank you for that. All right. I think the last two questions in the Lightning Lightning round. Number one, the last of the two is, what is one thing you wish every American knew? How
important both travel and exposure to diverse voices in art. When you're traveling, you are, by default, if you're open to things, exposed to, diverse voices, diverse cultures and voices that are not your own and that are unfamiliar to you. You find that in microcosm, of course, in books, in movies, in music, in museums, and things, and you find it in art. So I think the important thing that I think a lot, I wish every American knew, was how important it is to expose oneself to those diverse voices in myriad ways, in a library, in a local library, even if one doesn't have the ability to travel, to be open to that, in order to generate empathetic tendencies. In order to be open to these diverse voices and ways of living, because we're seeing a divisiveness, I think. You brought up America specifically. We're seeing a divisiveness in this country now that seems aggressive and oftentimes violent and toxic. And I think exposure to art in those ways would kind of alleviate that in a bit. And I think it might take a couple of generations of that sort of thing. But I think art activism in small, traditionally underserved communities in the US, could certainly help out with that. And I do think it would take time, but I think it could help out with that. And where folks are not just inundated with the mores of their own backyard, so to speak. But yeah, so So I wish for that, I suppose, to occur here.
I love that. We've obliterated the lightning concept, but
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it. I hope you are. So
I am.
I just want to respond to what you're saying by sharing a response that someone I've interviewed made to not this question, but he was someone who ended up he shot a woman when he was 13 in Florida and ended up spending almost 30 years in prison, 26 years in prison, 18 years in solitary confinement. It was amazing. And he's a spoken word poet. He's just got a book deal. And when I asked him at the end of the interview, I said, how can we as America avoid this kind of thing happening to 13-year-olds, to people who don't, who live in underserved areas, things like this. And he said, art. And it totally was not like, oh, social justice programs and, change the criminal justice system and stuff. It was like, no, it was art. Like, whoa, it's really interesting.
It's interesting because art doesn't, exist in a vacuum, right? I mean, like a communal experience of art, I think can, trickle into other arenas of the community, like social justice programs, right? And, and like, prison reform or whatever, like, I think one will affect the other. Like, art doesn't exist in a vacuum. And that's the beautiful thing about it. Like, art starts the conversation and affects other arenas. It's that beautiful ripple effect. So yeah.
Yeah. And I forget who said it, but they described art as a life acceleration device. Ooh, and this idea that if art is essentially sharing experience, now we can understand someone else's experience or perspective without having had to have lived it. I mean, granted, we might not get it as fully or whatever, but that it's really a paradigm shift to think of it that way instead of what we tend to do, watching or interacting, consuming content or interacting with people that look like us, who are safe, that kind of thing.
And even though it might not be direct stimuli, as you're talking about, as living it, as being in it, like indirect stimuli is better than no stimuli at all. And the wonderful thing about like the exposure to art is you are getting direct exposure to the inner workings of somebody else's brain in a way. You are, I mean, how intimate is that? I mean, you are basically getting the world or or an aspect of the world filtered through a very particular and very twitchy writerly or painterly or musical brain. So not only are you getting the thing itself, so if somebody's writing about South Africa, you are getting maybe an indirect exposure to aspects of South Africa, but you are also getting direct exposure to that very twitchy writerly brain that filters it and just kind of like girdles it toward artistic flourish on the page. So it's actually like an incredibly intimate and direct experience with another human being and indirect experience with that larger sea of stimuli too, which is great. So I think it works on you both ways.
I agree. Amazing. Okay. And the last question here it's about money. We've talked about just about all the big things in life aside from death. But this one is, what's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about money? Or what's something you're always sure to do with it or you never do with it?
Yeah, I'm always sure to devote it to experience rather than material. And, my family was always, the opposite. They're like, oh, if you devote it to this beautiful meal or this travel,
it's gone.
You'll have nothing, right?
Yeah,
you'll have nothing afterwards. And I'm like, you're so wrong. I'll have my life.
Yeah.
I'll have experience. I'll have my heart changed forever, perhaps, rather than, I don't know, a second refrigerator. So yes, I will keep fewer things cold, but I'll have a richer life, I think. So having not grown up, in a wealthy family, I had I started working when I was 11 years old. My first engagement with regard to making money was I was 11 years old and I was washing dishes in a fast food chicken shack on the outskirts of Chicago. And, then just kind of stayed in restaurants for a while. But I always felt that, and now it's a different time because of the pandemic. I do think, particularly like if I was that age now, I wonder how I would figure things out because I wouldn't always have restaurants to fall back on in order to make money during a pandemic. But I always prized experience over money, and I always just like burned through it. I would work for a little while, like money and job was always a means to an end for me. Like the amassing of money it felt like a very unsatisfying end unto itself. But like amassing it and then just blowing it on a big trip somewhere that of course I couldn't afford, and then going back and working again. And there were other folks in my family who socked away a lot more money and, still have more money, but they haven't had these experiences. And they would always ask me, like, how did you do that when you were making nothing? And the author, Andre Dubus, the wonderful short story writer, I remember wrote, and I read this, I think, when I was like 17 years old or something, and it made an impact on me back then. And it was, money is an easily solvable problem. If you're willing to, and for me, what that meant is if you're willing to do anything for a job, you can just kind of do all of these other things that you love to do as well. So I never cared about occupation. I never cared what it was that I did. What I cared about is what I could use that for in order to satisfy other hungers, I suppose.
Wow. I really love that. And the fact that you just did it. And I love that saying too. I haven't heard that money is an easily solvable problem. It brings to mind something a friend of mine once pointed out to me. He said his saying was, money can't solve money problems, which it's interesting. But the point he made was he paid off an employee's car. He paid off her loan. She came to work the next week with new debt, pointing out it was a mentality underneath the way she was, right? So interesting about money is an easily solvable problem, and perhaps money can't solve money problems. So no, that's awesome. Okay. At this point in the conversation, I want to make sure to tell you that I have made a $100 microloan on your behalf as a way of saying thank you to sharing your experience and your insight with me and everyone listening. I've done it through kiva.org. This is to a woman entrepreneur in Timor-Leste named Laura. She's 26 years old. She has 3 children. She farms. She grows and sells vegetables. So,
that's awesome. Cool.
Yeah. So thanks for giving me a reason to go make that.
Yeah, well, thanks for doing that. That's fabulous.
All right. With that, then let's transition our conversation. How you doing, by the way?
Yeah, but how does one answer that question in a socially functional way these days without being completely disingenuous, right?
Yeah, serious.
I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm feeling you're a very different guest from many of my guests in that the topics you write about are so diverse, and that's why as we transition to, and it's interesting to me that the flight of the Diamond Smugglers is, you've got it all done, but it's not till February that you're releasing it, right? So maybe I'm feeling a little scattered, even though I've read your book and obviously done some prep for this interview, but I want to be sure it's valuable, for you as well, which is why maybe what we do next, I know we're running short on that 90 minutes that I said we'd keep this to, but here's what I propose. If we talk about what is the thread, if there is one, behind all your writing, right? And then specifically talking about the Diamond Smugglers, because that's the current thing.
Okay. Yeah.
And then go to writing and creativity, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. I mean, the thread behind all of my writing is, so like, I see the writing process, and this might sound moony, but like, I see the writing process is kind of like walking through a meadow, let's say. And as you're walking through this meadow, you see kind of on the horizon this thing that you're questing after, this particular bit of subject matter that you want to directly engage, this truth that you're after, this secret behind, say, diamond smuggling pigeons, or this secret behind, say, from the Preparing the Ghost book, what were the behind the scenes goings on that fueled the first ever photograph taken of the giant squid in 1873, St. John's, Newfoundland, by some depressive reverend. In the Mad Feast book, what are the secrets behind why we eat, what we eat, where we eat it? What's the history there? And so I think as I see that kind of on the horizon, as I'm walking through this meadow, I find, so to speak, during the writing process, that I'm picking up all of these ancillary burrs on my pant cuffs. as I'm walking toward that thing that I only believe I'm questing after. And these ancillary burrs kind of manifest in the book as like these ancillary bits of subject matter that have to be reckoned with and have to kind of draw a chalk outline around the main subject. And so I try and like call up process-wise the imaginative alchemy I think necessary to associate these seemingly ancillary bits of subject matter with that main thread, okay? And it's oftentimes a fool's errand, but this is the writing process, right? I'm trying to find something out. I want to test the parameters of meaning to see what something means. And sometimes these seemingly dissimilar bits of subject matter are necessary to engage in order to see how I can try to connect that main bit of subject matter to these seemingly dissimilar things. What's the perfect bridge ingredient? What am I going to find out? It's like chemistry sometimes. Like, what am I going to find out when I mix this with this? Is there going to be an explosion? Is there going to be cohesion? Is there going to be collision? Is there going to be aversion? I don't know until I try it. But each thing teaches me about the parameters of that other thing and what that other thing can take, so to speak. So I think that kind of curiosity animates all of my books. That kind of like, I always encourage young writers, like, never lose the capacity to be surprised. The presumption of certainty in a book is always less interesting than questing after certainty, so to speak, because the presumption of certainty means or signals to the reader that the journey is over and there's no more room for surprise. And if there's no more room for surprise for the writer, typically there's not going to be a whole lot of surprises for the reader. And so the presumption of certainty always feels false. So I think like my books are always kind of resisting certainty in that way and just kind of pursuing questioning. So I guess that's craft-wise, I guess, a thread that kind of connects all of them. And we could talk about each of the books more specifically in their specific minutiae, so it's not all so abstract too, if you like. But
thank you for sharing that and what you're saying about never losing the capacity to be surprised. You know, there's no surprise to me that that's a philosophy or a dictum that you live and write by. Because as I read your recent book, Flight of the Diamond Smugglers, the whole thing about Mr. Lester. Is this guy real? Are you really going to meet him? What's it going to mean if you do? This. Let's turn the conversation to this book and why you decided to write it. I mean, I suppose the question is valid for any of your books. Why do you, I imagine these things take at least a couple years to research and write. What is it in your recent book? Tell us, Fly the Diamond Smugglers, a tale of pigeons, obsession, and greed along coastal South Africa. Why did you devote a big chunk of your life to writing this book?
Yeah, I'm easily obsessed. So I come from a long line of folks who occasionally suffer from crippling OCD, and I've kind of channeled mine into art making. I am naturally, and it's innate for me. I'm naturally obsessed with certain things, and I have a difficult time, like letting them go. But when I do, when I move from one book to the next, I force myself to kind of squeegee my brain clean of that previous obsession and move on to the next thing. So, I was obsessed with the giant squid and the first ever photograph taken of it in the book Preparing the Ghost. I had to squeegee that clean when I moved on to the Mad Feast, where I was interrogating like the meaning behind the ways in which we eat in America. And then after that, I had to squeegee my brain clean for Flight of the Diamond Smugglers. So I mentioned that my wife she was born and raised in Johannesburg, South Africa, and we had endured a number of losses. We were trying to conceive a child for a number of years, and it just wasn't working out for us. We had a lot of bad luck and suffered through what ended up being half a dozen miscarriages, a couple of them very, very late, and we were just wrecked. We were just destroyed.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, just like grieving terribly, and so my wife felt like, and I mean, the last few were here in Michigan, the last couple were here in Michigan, and she just kept saying, I need to go home. I need to go to South Africa. I need to be around my family. I need to be in my home country, even though she kind of claims a homelessness now as a almost like spiritual condition because she doesn't feel at home in South Africa necessarily either. But she needed to go back there, and we went back there. And when she was a child, her family would vacation, and this seems like an odd place to take a vacation, but they would go to Kimberley, South Africa, where there was just kind of like a museum built to service what is known as the Big Hole, which was an underground and above ground open cast diamond mine that was active in South Africa, in the 1800s up through the early 1900s. And it became a vacation spot, strangely. This old mine.
So random.
I know, this giant hole in the ground. I mean, so it's kind of like, it's almost like the Devil's Tower of South Africa now, right? So all of these like kitschy little shops have opened up around it. And so Louisa needed that comfort at the end of this period of having endured these losses. And so we conducted a weird funeral ceremony of sorts for our final miscarriage at the Big Hole in Kimberley, South Africa. And so I became really interested, just being there as, given my personality, in the Big Hole itself. The site of our kind of like saying goodbye to our desire and our expectations of being parents, right? And so it became just an incredibly charged place because of that. That was the actual physical site at which we just kind of gave up who we thought we were going to be for the rest of our lives. And so I wanted to find out everything I could about it, because I wanted to see how that big hole and everything I could find out about it could in some way contextualize my grief, it being the site where I gave all of this up, right? I mean, this is just how I started thinking. And so I started learning about, the history of diamond mining in South Africa. I thereby learned about the Diamond Coast of South Africa, which is like the northwest coast of South Africa, where it bumps up against Namibia to the north. And it was a previously closed off coast because De Beers, the conglomerate, owned all of it. And so these were company towns along the coast where they did a lot of mining. And De Beers closed it off to all outsiders for a number of years. And so only recently, as De Beers began withdrawing some of their interests there, did a couple of these previously forbidden towns, for the very first time, open their doors to the public. And of course, in doing this research, I love, as a writer and as a curious person, worming my way into forbidden territory. I trespass, and get a lot of joy out of it, so to speak. And so I felt like I needed to go there. There's these previously cloistered towns to see how people interacted with an outsider, to learn about the diamond mining culture there and so on. And I ended up meeting a guy there at a bar called Diamond Hunters, of all places, in Port Nolloth, South Africa. And he had a couple of drinks, and he was a former diamond diver, which meant he would like vacuum diamonds up from the seabed offshore there. And he started telling me, and I found this very strange, like this was a previously closed off town, and I thought people would be wary of an outsider, but it was almost the exact opposite. People were almost over eager to talk to me, to tell me about their lives, what they had seen, what they had done, to confess certain things to an outsider in a way that they couldn't confess to somebody who lived in that cloister with them. And so this guy actually told me that he was involved in diamond smuggling. And he was like, basically everybody here is involved in diamond smuggling. It's an unofficial part of the economy here, from, high up De Beers officials to folks like me, who were just like, was basically a janitor for the seafloor. And he started talking about all of these ingenious methods employed to smuggle diamonds. One of them being that diamond miners would sometimes sneak carrier pigeons, in their lunch pails onto mine property. And because of human rights laws, you can't x-ray somebody every day when they enter mine property and when they leave. So folks are sometimes, so you're x-rayed about 50% of the time, and the other 50% of the time you do step into an x-ray chamber, but you're given a placebo. So you never know if you're really being x-rayed or not. So folks would just risk it and bring carrier pigeons in their lunch bins and affix diamonds to their feet. And these were highly trained carrier pigeons. They would set them into the air where they would fly home to their families, and they would untie their diamonds and make quiet fortunes and things. It was really, really fascinating. And so, of course, as a curious person, as this guy's telling me this in the bar, I'm scribbling everything furiously down on the back of gas station receipts, right? And I'm thinking, oh, there's got to be a magazine piece in this or something. But being the obsessive that I am, I tumbled down the rabbit hole and talked to more people and more people. I went back to South Africa, 4 separate times to research this book. And it actually, you mentioned a couple of years, but this book has been in the making for a little over half a decade. And so, yeah, just tumbled down the rabbit hole. Eventually, the book blew up to 1,200 pages, which was just untenable, of course. And so a lot of the work was just cutting down that 1,200 pages to a reasonable 200. But there's so much wound up on the cutting room floor. But what's there, I think, is a wonderful distillation of this story and the story of these folks and the story of these pigeons.
Yeah. And your story, as you mentioned, starting with this grief and this curiosity. And that was something that I really appreciated. Some writing, consciously removes the writer, and yours was very personable. And I felt grateful for the opportunity to travel along with you while here at home.
I'm so glad. Thanks.
It's about considering yourself a writer. I understand that for many years you had some resistance to calling or thinking of yourself as a writer. Tell me about why that is and how you've overcome that, if you have.
I'm always wary of over-identifying as something. And maybe I'm self-deprecating in that way. I feel as if I'm a lot of things. And I feel like writing is one of the only things I'm good at. So maybe then I could call myself a writer. I feel like I'm really only good. I feel like I'm a decent cook, but I feel like I'm really good only at a couple of things. And writing is one of them. And walking, strangely, is the other. I think I'm a really good walker. So I just love moving through space in that way. And I feel like I could do it over various terrains. I don't know. That might be a weird thing to say. But I guess I never wanted to sound too self-aggrandizing when it came to it. I never wanted to sound have these delusions of grandeur, oh, I'm some lofty writer, because maybe I associated that with, oh, I could be dogmatic in a way about revealing my version of the world to other people as a gift. Here you go. You're welcome. So that's kind of not me. I feel as if I write not necessarily to dominate a conversation. And I know I'm talking a lot here today, but that's also because of this construct, right? But I mean, not to dominate a conversation, but to be part of it. And so the previous question that you scrapped is what do I hope for this book? Is that I hope it starts a wide reaching conversation. I hope people pick it up. I hope a bunch of people from various walks of life read the book. Maybe folks who have endured losses themselves and who are enduring grief. I mean, maybe derive some solace from this book in that. I feel in that what this book taught me and what I hope it might show other people is that our grief, however intense, is also beautifully, beautifully small. And part of this larger tapestry. Just because it's small doesn't mean it's not holy or something, but it sometimes feels that it's all consuming and it dominates everything. And we're the only folks experiencing this because we're feeling so intensely. But one of the most amazing things and one of the common denominators that we share as human beings is the endurance of grief. We all engage it. And it makes that beautiful in a way too, because it unites us. However horrific it is in individual ways and even on larger ways, conceptually, it's beautiful that it can be a uniting factor in that way. And what this book helped me do is it helped me realize that my grief is small, that it's not all encompassing, that my story of loss can exist on its own. And I wanted to find out what would happen if I embedded my grief into this larger context, into this larger engagement of pigeons and diamond smuggling and all of this. And how could that engagement and my obsession therewith help to contextualize my grief and make it more manageable? What could it teach me about my own grief and the ways in which I grieve and things? And so I feel as if at least formally speaking, the way the book is constructed, I would hope that it would offer perhaps other people who have endured loss that kind of solace, and maybe even inspire subsequent journeys, curious journeys, in order to contextualize grief. Like a wonderful salve to grief is, I guess for me, it comes naturally, but obsessing with a story that seemingly has nothing to do with your grief while enduring that grief also. And then allowing those things to strangely commingle and have one redirect and one recontextualize the other, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to think of it, because as I hear what you're saying, I wonder if one might engage in a pursuit to do that as an escape or a distraction, or if, there's a way, in the way I understand that you've done it, been able to basically integrate, or process your grief through the pursuit and the inquiry. What do you think?
It's so funny, like that you make that distinction. I feel like oftentimes a lot of artists and a lot of in order to art make, I think maybe this happens innately, or maybe artists sometimes have to force it, which is okay. I think that's okay. They oftentimes look longer and harder at a particular thing, maybe even a seemingly mundane or quotidian thing, than the average person. So long after many folks have looked away and moved on to the next thing, maybe the writer is still with it and still asking questions about it. And so you talk about like distraction and escape. And I think something like that began this way. And I think if I abandoned the inquiry at a certain point, it would have remained that way. A lovely distraction and escape that helped me for a little while, but then stopped. But I think the longer I stood with it, it evolved beyond mere distraction and escape, simply because I stuck with it for as long as I did. And so I think distraction and escape just kind of morphed into something else. It's kind of like, I don't know, all of a sudden I'm thinking of those like paper hoops that football players sometimes like run through when they're charging onto the field. And I think I finally got to the end of distraction and escape and broke through some sort of like paper hoop into some new space where this kind of pursuit and these lines of inquiry became something else, something beyond distraction and escape, because it actually doubled back on itself and made me examine my own grief harder rather than being distracted from it. It was the exact opposite. It made me fixate on it, but in a different way and through a different lens, basically to see what my grief was made of, what it could take without breaking, how profound was it, how diffuse was it, what did it mean, and so it almost, well, maybe it blurred my grief initially. Once I got through that paper hoop, it tightened the focus on it and it enlivened it and made it brighter and sharper and forced me to telescope in a bit. It's almost like adjusting the tracking on the old VCR, VHS tapes. It just like, it ended up taking away some of that static.
Wow. I have another teacher who once said, what's on the side of any feeling fully felt is peace. And I don't know if that was your experience by, engaging this inquiry so intensely for so long, but if you found that did somehow, not just that it did, but you transmuted your feelings of grief or loss into something, that's like peace.
I don't know what to call it. Maybe something like it. In order to get to real peace for me, because I'm a naturally restless person, I think I have a few more paper hoops to get through.
Yeah. There is no end, I think, to this progression, this life we're in. Certainly a physical end, but I want to share this with you too. I learned so much. It's part of what I enjoyed about this book. I had imagined when I saw it that it was very old, like the one, Preparing the Ghost. It was like maybe 100, almost 150 years old. And then when I realized that no, pigeons are used to smuggle diamonds, like even now. And so many other things about the diamond industry, about 46%, you mentioned this in the book, that 46% of diamond miners are between the ages of 5 and 16. It's like, holy cow. How many carrots are harvested a year? Like, just, it's almost hard to even imagine. 176 million carrots a year, which would be 77,603 pounds of diamonds produced in a single year.
Yep, that the corporation maintains a stronghold on in order to fictionalize a narrative of rarity and thereby, fictionalize value. Yeah.
Yeah, incredible. And that the diggers make the equivalent of about 20 cents a carat.
Yeah.
For something that we sell for like 6 to 30 grand a carat.
Yep. Yeah.
That's amazing. All the stuff you shared about pigeons, which was fascinating. I felt a little bit like I was watching Mr. Rogers, the fascination when I'm a kid about pigeons being able to fly 2,600 miles on the caloric equivalent of a single Cheeto.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But in order to figure that out, I had to do a lot of math, and so that's true. Yeah, they're amazing. Their anatomy is amazing. Their intelligence is amazing. There have been so many studies, and of course, we could never know this because, as the author W.G. Sebald once said, humans and non-human animals engage each other or admire each other, something like that. I'm going to butcher the quote. Engage or admire each other across a beautiful gulf of mutual misunderstanding. I love that we're still conducting studies to see, where the aim is to find out if pigeons have the capacity for love. To see how pigeons, of course, express pain. We still look at that. But pigeons, like crows, have the ability to differentiate between two different people based on facial recognition. They're known to recognize faces, and they're known to recognize the faces of past abusers, which makes you think about all of these, atrocious experiments, perhaps. But yeah, pigeons have been known to recognize the faces of past abusers. Pigeons have been known to recognize all 26 letters of the English alphabet. Yeah, pigeons have been known to exhibit a condition that we previously thought was limited to human beings, and that is superstitiousness.
How? What do we see that makes us know that?
It was B.F. Skinner, actually, the behavioral psychologist who conducted tests on pigeons, and there would be he would withhold food. He would essentially starve pigeons, and the pigeons eventually learned that if they behaved in a certain way for B.F. Skinner, it would yield a feeding. So certain pigeons began to Skinner called it superstition. If I do this, I will get this. And that involved turning around 3 times fast in a circle to the right, and then turning around 3 times fast in a circle to the left. Will that yield a feeding? And so engaging behavior that we typically, associate with OCD or neuroses or superstition, the pigeons began to exhibit that kind of behavior too. They're also fascinating creatures in that we've engaged them so variously in our mythologies across time, history, and culture. The pigeon, and there's no actual biological difference between the dove and the carrier pigeon. The pigeon.
I had no idea about that. It was another thing that fascinated me.
Right. Yeah. There is no difference. It's just a difference in naming. Right. And I know you're interested in naming, which is fascinating. Like, what's in a name, and what does a name mean? And of course, I think many writers would share your passion. But if we call something a dove, well, then in our religious narratives, oftentimes we've recognized it as holy, and if you did damage to a dove, oh goodness gracious! In our mythologies and in religious doctrine, oftentimes that meant bad news. But the pigeon, we call that a rat with wings.
Right.
What's in the name? And so we just have no compunction about deploying whole teams in cities to lay out toxic seed to kill what we call a pigeon infestation. But
oh yeah. Well, even the fact, as you point out in the book, that live pigeon shooting was an official event at the 1900 Paris Olympics.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
can you imagine if somebody even proposed that we have a live pigeon shoot as part of the summer games?
Right, right.
Like, holy cow.
Yeah, yeah, and it was seen as okay. And in South Africa, still today, these unofficial militias that are enabled by the diamond conglomerates, by De Beers, Transhex, Alex Cor, et alia. These unofficial militias are still kind of commissioned to go around and round up, because pigeons in the Diamond Coast of South Africa are seen as agents of the smuggling, and are banned. And so people raise pigeons in secret. It's very, very secretive there. But these militias go on these clandestine runs at night, kidnapping people's pigeons from their coops and taking them out to diamond restricted beaches, and basically conducting unofficial and somewhat like barbaric versions of the Olympic pigeon shoots of the early 20th century. Yeah, still happens there.
It's amazing. So much that I learned about pigeons, about diamonds, and you cover, like you said, a lot of cultures, the Egyptians, I think you talk about what the Greeks, believed so much. What else did you learn in the process of writing this, either about diamonds, about Africa, about birds, about yourself, anything that really surprised you or has made a difference for you?
Okay, yeah. Well, one surprising fact, and then I'll talk about like maybe something loftier, but like one surprising fact that I that really blew me away was that in this one particular coastal town in Alexander Bay, if the town council actually made it illegal to not shoot a pigeon on site if you had the means to do so, or to just kill it if you had the means to do so. I don't know if that means like if you were carrying a ballpoint pen, if you should just but like that was actually a law on the books. It was illegal to not kill a pigeon if you spotted one, should you have the means to do so. People were very wishy-washy about talking to me about the ways in which that was enforced, but that was fascinating. Other smuggling means that I found incredibly fascinating was folks would, and this was during the height, it's still a problem, but this was during like the height of the AIDS scare in South Africa. Folks would slash open their own arms on site. There were plenty of sharp objects in a diamond mine. They would slash open their own arms and shove a bunch of rough diamonds inside the wound. And then due to AIDS scares and the bleeding, mine security would often rush that person to the hospital. And oftentimes there was a person at the hospital who was in on the smuggling scam, who would then retrieve the diamonds from the wound and give the person a small kickback, who actually slashed themselves open. Other times they would sew up the diamonds into the wound there on site, and then when they were out of sight of other folks at the hospital, they would reopen it, and they would meet and reopen it and take the diamonds out together and do all of this. Folks would smuggle diamonds in the sockets behind their glass eyes. Folks would smuggle diamonds across the Namibia-South Africa border, packed into the diapers of their infants. So I guess the thing that surprised me about that in a loftier way is I was surprised at the nuanced levels of human ingenuity born of desperation, and the sort of desperation that was birthed, so to speak, due to corporate rapaciousness. So corporate rapaciousness, in a way, enabled a desperation. I mean, essentially, a lot of folks compared the system on coastal South Africa to the feudal system. There are the lords and the vassals, and the lord culture kind of elicits a desperation in the vassal culture if the vassal culture wants to persist and escape a present / horrific life condition. And so like the ingenuity born of that induced desperation was ever fascinating to me. It's horrifying. It's weirdly inspirational. And it just is a testament to human creativity when it comes to survival on various levels, however you want to look at survival. And that that fascinated me as an observer.
Wow. Well, and especially too, and I don't think we've touched on this, but about especially a little while ago, decades ago, and I'm sure even still today to some degree, that the punishment for this, if people were caught, they'd be stabbed, they'd be shot, they'd have digits chopped off. Like this was this common practice, right?
Yeah.
People just right on sight, shot through the head, things like that.
Yep. People, routinely, still today, people oftentimes just disappear if they're oftentimes even accused of smuggling. So immediate execution, mutilation, in lesser cases, just complete eviction from the only town that they've ever known, and just kind of like thrown out into the gullet of the desert. And things, so completely forsaken. So in these towns, even if one has the means to do so, even if one has a quote unquote legal means to do so, folks are very reluctant about buying new things. If somebody shows up in one of these towns with a new car, for instance, the default is this person is smuggling diamonds. And then they will be kind of like fiercely investigated and intimidated in various ways, sometimes physical ways. Yeah.
Yeah, that was something I had never learned about, and including too what you shared about De Beers. Like, I didn't know Rhodesia was named for John Rhodes, an entire country, and his relationship with, I forget his sometimes competitor, sometimes lover.
Barney Bernardo.
Barney Bernardo. Thought that was whole interesting. And the Oppenheimers. And so much. This covers so much, as we've discussed. I do hope people pick it up. I haven't learned a lot of new words, and it's been a while. I don't recall the word right now, but I didn't even know there was a word for the crossbar on a crucifix.
Oh yeah. The stipes and the patibulum.
Yeah, the patibulum. Anyway, that was even reading these. So, okay. I know we've covered so much, and I didn't leave us, of course, we've talked about writing in this some. We didn't get into the nitty-gritty of your routines and your habits and your advice for others or marketing. But I think just in going ahead and wrapping up anyway, I do want to just ask, I understand you now teach creative writing there in Michigan. Right. So you're not only someone who has the authority to speak from having produced a number of books, but also someone who teaches this as well. So I just have two last questions. The first one is about, how do you think it is that you are able, I would use the word prolific, but I might just use the word productive. How is it that you are able to take your experience and your process and however you do it, and I guess the context for this question is that a lot of people want to do this. A lot of people wish, and it's kind of like someone once said, a lot of people want to have run a marathon. Not very many people want to run a marathon. A lot of people want to have written a book. They don't actually want to write a book. What is it that you think makes you different, either qualitatively or something you do, that results in books?
Sure. Yeah. I could only speak to my own journey on this, because I have a bunch of writer friends who are like wonderfully prolific, who have engaged completely different journeys. For me, travel early was essential. I felt like I needed to, as I talked long ago about snapping myself out of my comfort zone and always being compelled to do that. And so travel was important for me to just get out of my own backyard and gather stories, listen, see new things, smell new things, taste new things, talk to people, listen to people, get out there and gather stories, which maybe, you talked about running a marathon that involves training, of course. Maybe that's some kind of training for writing as far as that goes. I don't know. I'm training myself to be curious and surprised. It never occurred to me that way, because that's just my personality. That's just what I needed and wanted to do. Although I have friends who have never left an academic cloister who are writing amazing things, and that journey worked for them. For me, I think I'm prolific because I don't know any other way to live. I do it because I can't not do it. And I do think there are other folks who have real talents at, somebody who wants to write. I think if you're naturally obsessive, that's great. I think if you're not, but you also want to write, I think one can manufacture obsession.
How?
By reading, I think. I think like the more one reads, like the more one is exposed to things that can just kind of like drum something up. By forcing yourself to stand in your backyard and watch birds, or something, like stand in one place and just look and look and look and see some weird aspect about bird behavior that you've never seen before. I'll tell you how I manufacture obsession, and this is going to sound totally boring, but it's true. Like sometimes I feel like I have something in me that I want to dislodge onto the page, but I can't quite put words to it yet, and I don't know quite how to get it out. And I feel as if I need some sort of like inspirational, I don't know, syrup of ipecac, so to speak. And so what helps for me is I'll go to my bookshelf and I have a bunch of these Audubon guides. I have a bunch of Audubon bird books and Audubon fish books that are now put out by the Audubon Society. And I'll pluck off the Audubon bird book and I'll just thumb through it and I'll read about bird facts. And just eventually that will shake something loose for me, whether it's directly about birds or not, because there is something in there that I wouldn't have previously known that I will find fascinating. You talked about learning new words and things like that. I'm always hungry for new words, which is why I play Block Talk, right? And so I always learn like something about like the parts of a feather. I'm really interested in diagrams and the way things are named, which is probably why I know what the parts of a crucifix are called. I'm interested in what the parts of things are called. Like the thing together is the crucifix, but when you break it down into its parts, what do you call it? And so I love reading about feather parts in these Audubon bird books. What are the parts of a feather called? How is that broken down? And I'm learning new words, and sometimes just even the sound of a word will excite me and make me want to like incorporate it into something. And so I guess that's how I would manufacture obsession. There are numerous ways to do it. Bird watching, going for a walk, looking through an Audubon bird book is I guess how I do it. And it sounds silly, but it works for me.
Yeah, and that's to me one of the really beautiful, sometimes frustrating, sometimes deeply rewarding aspects of, I think, any creative pursuit is learning ourselves. What are our preferences? What are our styles? What works for us? What doesn't work for us, So, no, that's awesome. I realized, too, that I do want to ask you this. So I want to ask you about that story you wrote in 5th grade.
Okay.
Because this seems to me this was a pretty pivotal moment for you as a writer. You were writing, you were sharing, you were collaborating. So will you give us the sketch on what this was?
Of course. Yeah. Before that, I one more piece of advice that a writer mentor shared with me a long time ago, and it was the poet Alberto Rios. And he said to me, the whole trick with writing is staying in the room. Stay in the room. Keep your butt in the chair, essentially. Stay in the room. So sit in front of the computer and start writing, or sit in front of your notebook and start writing. And when you think you've gotten it all out, hang out in that room for another hour. Stay with it for another hour and see what comes out, because that's oftentimes when the magic happens. And a lot of writers say this, but I'll repeat this too. The muse shows up during the process, not beforehand. The muse shows up during the process, not beforehand. So in order for the muse to show up, you just have to sit down and start writing, no matter what it is. Just start getting anything out. Just start scribbling words on a page in order to generate something, in order to conjure the muse, in order to manufacture that inspiration, so to speak. So it started for me in 5th grade, like my inspiration with, my excitement about writing. My mom was a school teacher. She was a junior high school English teacher, in fact, in inner city Chicago. And she would read to me just, incessantly as a kid. And I was obsessed with books, I guess because of that, maybe. And so then I wanted to try my hand at writing also. And I had a friend who was nerdy like me, and we decided to collaborate on this serial, a bunch of short stories. And we were little boys, okay? So forgive me, but like about a serial killer. Okay, like I was obsessed at that point with like the Friday the 13th movies and Nightmare on Elm Street and all of that stuff. The John Carter, like Halloween and all of that. And so we wanted to try our hand at the serial killer genre. And we started writing these stories called Death at Dark. And the second one was Death at Dark 2, then Death at Dark 3, then Death at Dark 4. And we mentioned it in conversation with our fifth grade English teacher, Mrs. Buckheim, and she was so excited that two of her students were like, these two boys were writing extracurricularly, and that she, at the end of her classes, she allowed us to give readings of our Death at Dark series to the class. And brilliant, we found that in order to keep our classmates' attention, in order to keep them rapt and riveted, we had to ratchet up the gruesomeness of each subsequent installment. It couldn't be repetitious because they'd be like, been there, done that. So we really had to ratchet it up with whatever our inflamed fifth grade minds could conjure. And so I remember, I think it was Death at Dark. It could have been 11 or 12. I don't know, who remembers? But I remember the description. It was mine. And this serial killer forced the hand of his victim, this man, into a sink drain where there was a garbage disposal. And then he turned the garbage disposal on and ground the man's hand up. And the man pulled his hand out of the garbage disposal. And the description was, the blood ran like egg yolk. Strangely enough, and maybe I started thinking about pigeons early, the victim kept pigeons. And he withdrew his hand and the blood was dripping as it was, like egg yolk. I know it's silly, and then one of his pigeons had escaped and flew into the kitchen. And the serial killer then snatched the pigeon out of the air and stabbed the man in the chest with the bird. And the bird asphyxiated in the man's chest cavity, its wings flapping madly as the blood was dripping and all of this. And in the story, the man and his pigeon die simultaneously, and then their spirits ascend from their respective bodies into the air like fire smoke, and then they twine like a DNA helix. And that was the description. That's how we ratcheted it up for Death at Dark 11. And the class's jaws just dropped. And Shannon Elliott, this cheerleader on whom I just had a mad crush at the time, started crying at the description. And I found out later why, but she started crying at the description. But to make a longer story short, Mrs. Buckheim called me and Ryan after class, and she banned us from reading. She was mad, and she banned us from reading any subsequent installments. We had crossed the line. We violated some unspoken parameter, and she was angry about it. And at first we were almost in tears. We thought we were getting in trouble for our work. No, we were getting in trouble for our art, which is really, and then the more we thought about it, the more we were kind of oddly excited by it, that not only did our words have the power to make Shannon Elliott, goddess of Aptekissic Junior High School, cry, but it also gave the power, and also allowed us the power to get banned from reading in an English class. And so that power was just kind of oddly electric to our young selves, and a little scary, but also a little addictive. And we kind of wanted to do it again. So, and later on, I realized that yes, a lot of good art makes trouble. A lot of good art doesn't aim to confirm a reader's expectations. It aims to agitate them. It aims to agitate readerly expectations, not confirm them. And so I think I realized that for the first time then in fifth grade, though I didn't have the words to put to it.
Wow. Did your friend go on to become a writer as well, or what was his path?
So to speak, he's a lawyer now. So he still uses words. We still talk.
Wow.
Yeah, we still talk. He still uses words, but he's like a condominium attorney now. So he writes all of these treatises on mold and bat guano. Yeah. So
that's amazing. Well, I've really enjoyed and appreciate this conversation. I hope listeners have as well. The final question I have for you is just what advice or encouragement you would leave anybody listening with who is either at the beginning of, they haven't started really with their creative project, or maybe they're in the middle of it and haven't managed to get it done just yet. What do you say to somebody who's in that situation?
Definitely. I mean, it's kind of platitudinous at this point to say like stick with it, stay with it, but don't prematurely abandon anything. Trust in your passion, trust in your obsessions, trust in your eye, trust in your voice, and trust in your work. Your life and everything that, all of this experience that you've amassed up until this point, nobody else has. Not in this way. And then even if they've amassed similar experience, nobody greets it or processes it in the same way that you do, and then filters it in the same way that you do, and then puts it down on the page in the same way that you do and that you will. Everybody has something to say in that way. It just takes patience, practice of craft, so on and so forth, But and sometimes that feels like I always talk about writing being like a conversation and fostering that essential dialogue, but sometimes it could feel like a very isolated, lonely pursuit. But know that there are communities out there of like-minded folks. I didn't know that when I was working in restaurant kitchens. I would go out with folks after a long shift and have a couple of drinks to unwind before bed. And sometimes we would say, hey, what do you like doing in your spare time when you're not cooking? And I would say, yeah, I like writing poems. And it was a fabulous conversation killer. But there are other communities out there that I found of like-minded folks who love talking about that sort of thing. So seeking out those communities and finding that kind of balance, finding a way to foster that essential dialogue, whether it's in a writing group or an MFA program, or just like a community writing group is what I mean, or a book club. There are, and eventually with editors and agents and publishers and things, the essential dialogue has to begin somewhere. And I'm always telling young writers too, don't be discouraged by rejection to the point where you stop making things. Making things, creating things, making things is incredibly important. It basically, if you're making things, you're building a levee against a lot of other atrociousness. However inadequate and fragile that levee may seem sometimes, it's important putting art out into the world, making things, making that positive contribution. And so don't be discouraged by rejection letters when you submit things and things. Be discouraged, but not to the point of stopping, because rejection is part of that essential dialogue. If you are not being rejected, that means you're not part of the conversation. If you are being rejected early on, it means at least you're part of the conversation. And you will collect rejection, as most writers have done, myself included. You'll collect them and you'll collect them and you collect them until finally, you're playing the odds here, somebody will accept your work for publication. I mean, it'll happen. But if you never start that conversation, and if you're not willing to be rejected and greet that as part of the essential dialogue, it's tough to develop these relationships with editors and like-minded folks. So yeah.
No, I love that. And I think it was in Stephen King's memoir On Writing where he talks about having the railroad spike with all the rejection letters punched through it above his writing desk.
Yeah. It's a common practice for writers. They keep it in their office. They paper the walls with their rejection letters and things. And I love King's meditation on writing. He's a brilliant man. Yeah.
And two, I love what you're saying about not to the point of stopping. Like, be discouraged, but not to the point of stopping creating things. And I don't know if you see this way as well, but I often think of, I think it was Steinbeck, who ended up moving to Hollywood after having been a novelist and tried his hand at screenwriting, but never made it in screenwriting and died feeling like he was a failure. But anybody today would say he was an amazing success. So that disconnect between our own judgment of our success.
Yeah.
Right?
That happened with Faulkner too. Like Faulkner went out to Hollywood and contributed to, I think Faulkner was a co-writer on that Bogart movie, The Big Sleep.
Oh yeah? I didn't know that.
Yeah, but Faulkner there was just small potatoes and, but hey, the Sound and the Fury.
Yeah. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
If they want to know more about you or they want to connect with you, what would you have them do?
The first thing I would say is check out my books. Like if you want to connect with me, check out the books. I mean, if you want to connect with me, just directly for something, I'm contactable through my website, which is just MatthewGFrank.com.
Cool. This has been great, and your work is inspiring. I really appreciate the chance to connect. I've enjoyed getting to know you. I don't know when or where exactly we'll connect again, but I know we will, and I will look forward to that day.
Me too, Brilliant. Yeah, I hope we cross paths again one way or another, and I appreciate the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and next time you're in Utah, which whenever it is, I know it's secretly the center of the universe, and I did mean to tell you, I loved what you wrote in the Mad Feast about funeral potatoes.
Oh, yeah. I have a story about that, but that's for another time.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear it. So next time we talk, maybe. But next time you're here out this way in the West, please let me know. And next time I'm out there, we'll see. I know we're both somewhat vagabonds. The pandemic's changed that a little bit for just about everybody, but
that sounds great. And hopefully one day we'll get to break bread over the same table. That would be
I would love that. That'd be really fun.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life isn't working for many people. Whether it's in the developed world, where we're dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, divorce, jobs we hate, relationships that don't work, or people in the developing world who don't have access to clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or who live in conflict zones, there's a lot of people on the planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, I invite you to connect with me at goodliving.com. I've created Life's Best Practices Breakthrough Coaching to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated school, you're going through a divorce, you just got married, you're headed into retirement, you're starting a business, you just lost your job, whatever it is you're facing, I've developed a 36-week course that you go through with me and a community of achievers and seekers who are committed to improving their own lives and the lives of others. So through this online program, you will have the opportunity to go deep into every area of your life, explore life's big questions, create answers for yourself in community, get clarity and accountability. If that's something you're interested to learn about, I invite you to contact me directly at brian@brianmiller.com or by visiting goodliving.com.